Welcome back to another episode of the Old Fashioned Real Estate Show. I'm Brian Leverage.
Oh, sorry, I was in a trance. I was staring at my delicious looking drink, which I haven't tried yet. I'm Jeffrey Holst, and that's Brian Leverage. He already introduced himself, but hey, whatever.
Yeah. So, Jeff, after you finish that...
That is a strong drink, Brian.
What is consisting mostly of bourbon.
Fair enough. So we have an interesting topic today. We're going to talk about the difference between economic occupancy and physical occupancy.
Yeah.
And we're going to do that right after this.
Welcome to the Old Fashioned Real Estate Show, where hosts Brian Leverage and Jeffrey Holst for our old fashioned real estate advice.
So, economic occupancy, Brian. What is it and why does it matter?
Well, it's important for a lot of reasons because it really has to do with the income production of a property itself, right? So most people look at occupancy of a property, or they refer to it as vacancy, right? So you see something that says, a property is at 95% occupied, right? That means 95% of the actual units are rented out, but it doesn't actually mean...
Yeah, I mean, this is a real issue, actually. So we see pro formas all the time that say occupancy is 75, 85, 95, 100%, whatever. A lot of times they say 100%, which you're always going to be a little skeptical about because 100% is very unusual and usually very temporary. But the thing is, if you have 100% of the units full and only 50% of the people are paying... It's actually almost worse than it's actually kind of worse than if you actually have 50% of the units vacant.
Yeah, that's right. So for that reason, it's most important to really focus on economic occupancy, right? Which there's a couple different ways that breaks down.
So just to be clear, what economic occupancy is it's the amount of rent that you actually collect versus what you theoretically could have collected.
Yeah.
So if you could have collected $100,000 in rent for a period of time and you only collected $80,000, then your economic occupancy would be 80% and 20% economic vacancy then in that scenario. And so there's a couple of different ways that could happen. One would be if you just have bad debt. You have people in the units that aren't paying, and that's the case where we're seeing this in some markets now where people are saying it's 100% occupied, but in reality, 20% of the people aren't paying because they're on maybe a COVID waiver or something like that.
Yeah. Then you also have other things like concessions.
Sure.
Right?
And in some markets that's common. It's not super common in our markets that we're in right now. But basically what a concession is when they say, if you move in, your first month will be $99 or you get 2 months free. And you do see that on the non-residential side in our market a fair amount, where you say to someone, like, if you do the renovations, then your own build out. In fact, we just did a deal like this recently where they're not going to pay us until September. And it's April right now.
That's right.
So that several months is technically a form of economic vacancy for that property. Mm-hmm. And so that's the sort of the second bucket. So when you think about like money that you could receive that you don't receive, it kind of falls into these three different buckets. So the first one is bad debt, right? People not paying. The second one is concessions, which we just covered. And then the third one is...
I was hoping you'd have that.
Fair enough. So you don't remember what the third one was.
Went in and right out the other.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So the third one is actually, I don't remember either. I mean, give me a second and I'll come back after this commercial and tell you what it is. And now a word from our sponsors. Who's sponsoring us today, Brian?
Well, we are, Jeff.
We are. How amazing. So we want to tell you about how you can save an enormous amount of money on your taxes and how Brian and I have been able to eliminate our taxes entirely.
You guys need to learn about cost segregation, which you can do by going to our website, oldfashionedtaxsavings.com.
Yes, and if you go there and you fill out the form, you can get a free, no-cost benefit analysis that will show you how much money you can save and what it will take to do that. Okay, so welcome back. I looked at my notes briefly, and the reason we couldn't remember is because we'd actually covered it already without realizing we had covered it. And the third way that you have economic vacancy is if you have actual vacancy.
Right.
So if you have a unit that doesn't have someone in it, that is a form of economic vacancy. Because actual vacancy is only part of the picture. It's not the whole picture.
Right.
So, Brian, when you're thinking about looking at a new real estate investment, how do you evaluate this stuff? Like, look, let's say I came to you and said, hey, I want to sell you this 10-unit building that I have, right? And it's 100% occupied. What's the next step for you? What are you thinking about?
Well, as part of our due diligence, we're going to ask for all of the operating documents, the leases, tax returns, management statements if it's being professionally managed, etc. Because you want to see, it's one thing to put a pro forma together and submit, and send that out to the general buying public. You're going to put your best foot forward on that. But as the buyer of the property, it's your duty to kind of dig into that data as much as you can. So we ask for the actual leases, right?
Sure.
We may even get the tenants to sign estoppel certificates as part of that, because that essentially keeps the seller from providing fraudulent rental data in the first place. And then you're looking at ledgers, because you want to see the actual payment history, right? Like there's your economic occupancy right there.
And why that might matter, right? Say I rent an apartment for $1,000 a month, but the first 2 months I give them free, right? And maybe now the last couple of months they've paid that $1,000 a month, but is the rent really $1,000 a month if it's a 12-month lease and 2 months were free? No, it's really $10,000 over a 12-month period, which is much less than $12,000. Obviously,
that's right.
$2,000 less. And so the real rent in that situation is like $840 or something around there. And that matters, because when they go to renew, that tenant is not always, but they may look for another opportunity to get another discount. They may ask you for a month free to sign the lease, or they might say something like, I'm going to just go to the guy down the street who will give me 2 months free to move in. And so when you're thinking about that kind of vacancy, even though it doesn't impact the rent roll today, it matters when you get to the renewal period.
And in a similar fashion, if using your same $1,000 rent example, if you've got somebody that is supposed to be paying you $1,000 and they're paying late during the month, they're not actually paying the late fee, and those balances are rolling over. Say they're only paying $900 a month. It's the same math.
Yeah, and actually, the late fee is a really interesting point, because if somebody doesn't pay a late fee and then you're just constantly waiving that late fee, that's another form of economic vacancy. Even though you can say, hey, I'm collecting $1,000 every month, but you're collecting it late every month, and that costs you as the owner or the property manager revenue that you could have otherwise had, and then you waive that late fee, you're creating a situation where they're constantly late paying, and late payers tend to turn into no payers eventually.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, I think, in your experience, that's a fair assumption.
Yes. Yeah, no, if they're habitually late, it's only a matter of time typically before they become permanently late.
Right. And well, and the thing is, because what happens is they get late for one reason, and then they're not catching up, and they're not catching up, and they're not catching up, and then something happens again, and they go, I can't catch up, and I'm already behind. Now they're a month behind instead of 2 weeks behind. And when you're a month behind, you end up getting evicted.
Well,
that's just what's going to end up happening.
Yeah, and I mean, in this stuff, it's may not sound like it's very important on some levels, but it really is, because, frankly, as is the case with all income-producing properties, their value is derived from the net operating income. So the more income you're collecting, the odds are the higher your NOI is going to be as a result of that, which is going to give you a more favorable valuation when you either go to sell or refinance.
Yeah, and again, that's where these things like not getting late fees, not getting pet deposits, whatever it might be, matter, because you might say, well, it's only $25 or $50 for a late fee, whatever it might be in that market, right? And it's just $50. But the thing is, $50 every month, and especially if you have like a 10 or 20 or 30 unit building, and maybe a third of the people are paying late, and you're missing out on $50, then it starts to really add up, and it makes a huge difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, just on the $50 example, I mean, that's $600 a year in late fee income that you're not getting. And even, I mean, at a 10 cap, which our market is well below.
Every market. It's got to be $10,000 a year extra equity that you're losing.
$6,000 in value just at a 10 cap valuation.
Yeah,
right?
and of course at a 5 or 6 cap like most markets, it's double that.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely something that people need to consider. So that's kind of the difference between physical occupancy and economic occupancy. If you have any questions about that, I would say feel free to reach out to us either by putting a comment below or by just sending us an email or messaging us on Facebook or Instagram or any of those exciting places. So Brian, anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
See you next time.
Yeah, and don't forget to get your cost segregations done.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, thank you very much, and
cheers.
So